topic of our roundtable is structures of knowledge, epistemological reconvergence of science and humanities. And you, I think, have all received the outline of Professor Wallerstein's talk, and you will have noticed that there is a question mark at the end. So it's not certain that there will be reconvergence of science and humanities, but the Professor Wallerstein will be talking about the possibility of the reconvergence of science and humanities. So the Professor Wallerstein is too well known for me. His BA, MA, PhD all at Columbia, and taught at Columbia, McGill, and Binghamton, the all east coast of United States, and McGill is of course in Canada. And then he was after retiring from teaching sociology, he was responsible for the Brodell Center at Binghamton University, and also was responsible for the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. So Professor Wallerstein has worked internationally, and he tells me that he works with 7 or 8 languages. I don't remember all what. And unfortunately, he doesn't yet know. He doesn't yet speak Korean. But as you know, Korean is a very easy language. You can you can learn it in 30 minutes, they say. And next time Professor Wallerstein comes, he will perhaps talk to you in Korean. Let us hope so. You know, most of you, I think, are familiar with his the magnum opus, which is World Systems Analysis. It came out in first volume of this work came out in 1945, and then the subsequent volumes continued to come out. And last year, 2011, there was the 4th volume, and I hear that 2 more volumes are forthcoming. I don't know whether that will be the last, but certainly 2 more volumes. And I'm not one of the themes. One of his themes today is uncertainty of knowledge, uncertainty of the future, because of the impending collapse of the world system that had been in place for the last 500 years. So I don't know whether your next 2 books will be continuation of your previous books or something totally different. This is something we are all very much interested in, and we are going to ask you to give us a lead-off discussion on the topic, on our topic, for about 20 minutes. And then our members of our panel, the Professor Kim Sang-jun, Professor Kim Young-sik, Professor Kim Moon-ung, and Professor Kwon Gi-bung, they will each comment on your lead-off speech for 10 minutes, and you will have chance to respond to them for 10 minutes. The whole process, I think, will take a little over an hour, and then we will open the floor to the general audience. You see that there is a very big interest in you among students, and this Q&A session will be conducted both in English and Korean, so that those who don't feel comfortable with English can use Korean. And I will be introducing the professors who will be acting as discussants as their turn, each of their turn comes up. And so may I introduce, may I ask Professor Wallerstein to kindly begin his 20-minute introductory remarks on the topic today, the structures of knowledge. Yes.
You underline the fact that there was a question mark in the title. There's another thing to notice. I don't talk of the convergence of science and the humanities. I talk of the reconvergence, which implies that they were previously convergent. And that's a very important starting point. Over the past 5,000 years, there have been many different civilizations across the world. They all had structures of knowledge. And these structures of knowledge were not the same. They were different. So what was historically was considered knowledge in Korea was not the same thing as what was considered knowledge in Egypt or in the Western world. But they all had a single common feature, which was that all...
Could you speak
a bit louder, yes. They all had one common feature, which is that they had a single epistemology. All knowledge was known in the same way. Now, something very curious happened in the Western world. Let me give you the two examples that I wanted to give you from the Western tradition of the single mode of knowledge. Aristotle, as you must know, was a very prolific writer, and we have many, many books by Aristotle. But if you notice the titles of these books, Aristotle wrote about everything. He wrote about metaphysics, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about politics, he wrote about science. He didn't think it was a strange thing for him to write about everything. And the other example, which is more closer to us, is Immanuel Kant, who was actually a professor at a Western university, at the University of Königsberg. And if you look at the courses that he gave, he of course gave courses in what we now call philosophy, that is in metaphysics, for example, and in ethics. But he also gave courses in international relations, he gave courses in poetry, he gave courses in astronomy. He did not think it was a strange thing to give courses in all these different topics. They were all part of knowledge. Now, if you look at what happened within the Western world, in the university system and in other structures of knowledge, up to about 1500, all knowledge was dominated by theology. The way you knew the truth was through theological mode. The church told you what the truth was, and the rest of us had to live within that tradition. And along about 1500 or 1600 came along what we call the philosophers. And they said, but this is arbitrary. What the church is teaching us is arbitrary, and in fact, human beings don't need to go via the church to know what is true. The truth is out there to be discovered by us. There is something we might call natural law, which is there for us to discover. And we, the philosophers, are the people who can discover it without going through the church. And by about 1750, there was another group of people who came along. We now call them scientists. They didn't have that term at that time. And they said, you philosophers are as bad as the theologians. You tell us that their truth is arbitrary, but we tell you your truth is arbitrary. How do you know what you know? The only way you can really know is if you have empirical evidence of that, and then you can validate this. So we propose that the way to know the truth is through empirical evidence, to what we these days call science. Now, in the long period from about 1750 to 1850, several things happened. First of all, the universities were revived. We think of Western universities as having some kind of continuity from the medieval university, and in name they remain the same. But in fact, the Western universities had become moribund between about 1500 and 1750, and now they were revived as new kinds of structures, much more bureaucratic, in which professors were there, what we now call full-time. They were paid salaries. And students were there, what we now call full-time. They were students at the university seeking particular degrees in the university. And in this period, what we now call science moved into the university system and began to create a faculty. Have you ever reflected on the fact that when you get a doctorate in any university today, it is called normally, in most cases, a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy. Even if you're an astronomer or a chemist, you get a doctorate in philosophy. That's a legacy from the fact that this all emerged from the medieval faculty of philosophy. And when it was split into two faculties at least, sciences and humanities, we retained the name Doctor of Philosophy, but it no longer meant the same thing. And what happened is that the scientists came in and they began to create a separate faculty which had the name, some kind of name like Faculty of Sciences. And they asserted that we are the only ones who can know the truth. It used to be in the old system that you could know the good, the beautiful, and the true all at the same time. And the scientists said, no. We can tell you the truth. What is beautiful, what is good, these are metaphysical questions. We are not concerned with that. And so there was a reaction to that. And there were some people who said, no, that's not at all how you know the truth. The way you know what is true, what is good, what is beautiful is through empathetic reconstruction of reality. And this is what we, the humanities, stand for. So there was this strong division of two different ways of knowing. First time in the history of the world. And something called social science begins to emerge for the first time in the 19th century. And the social scientists were responding. sorry. I'm sorry. And the social scientists were responding to a new social reality, which was the fact that sovereignty was said to lie with the people for the first time. And this seemed a very dangerous doctrine. But some people said, well, if it does lie with the people, we have to study the people, and this becomes the concept of social science. Social science becomes the third faculty, except that it didn't have its own epistemology. So we have the following situation in which science says you know things in one way, humanity says you know things in another way, an opposite way, and the social scientists were in between, and they didn't have a special way of knowing. So they split. They split right down the middle from the beginning of those social scientists, thank you, who said we can know the way, the truth, the way natural scientists know. And then there were other social scientists who said, no, we can know the way only the way the humanities know it. Now, I think of this as social science being like an outstretched person, each arm attached to two horses going in opposite directions, one the scientists, one the humanities, and the social scientists just pulled apart by this centrifugal movement. But what then happens is we get not only faculties that are separate and different, but within each faculty we begin to have something called disciplines. And disciplines were claims to specificity. They said, we have something called chemistry. We have something called English literature. We have something called history, or we have something called economics, and it has very narrow boundaries, and it's very specialized knowledge, and if you want to learn that, you have to go to that discipline, and you have to stick within that discipline. So we get a parcelization of the forms of knowledge, not only in terms of the epistemology, but within each epistemological division, subdivisions called disciplines. And this gets stronger and stronger up until approximately the Second World War. Now, in this basic division between science and the humanities, they both need support. From whom? Well, they need financial support. They need moral support from governments, from the general public. And so there's a big battle that goes on for who is more important. And basically, if you look at what happened from about 1800 to about 1945, steadily the scientists get stronger and stronger and stronger, because they say, look, we can give you evidence of the utility of what we're doing. You see, there are these inventions, these wonderful things that make life better, and we produce that. Well, what did the humanists produce that's useful for you? So you should concentrate your energy on us. And that wins out bit by bit. And then a second thing happens. This is the same period of time as the Western world is conquering the rest of the world. And one of the aspects of this conquest is they're saying, and you've got to copy our institutions. If you want to be modern, you have to be modern in the way we're modern. So you have to create universities that replicate our structures. And if you look around the world, you begin to see the emergence of these universities in various parts of the world, and they have the same kind of faculty systems and the same kind of departments, etc. And this reaches a sort of culminating point in the period 1945 to 1970, in which this dominance of science, the structures of the university, the epistemological split is more or less accepted everywhere, except that it also begins to get in trouble in this period. Why does it begin to get in trouble? For a lot of reasons. One of the reasons has to do with U.S. hegemony in the world system. It's all very well to say that in Africa they have tribes, and therefore you have to use anthropology to understand them. And it's all very well to say in Persia or in China they have civilizations and you have to use Oriental studies to understand them. But this was a different world now. We suddenly have national liberation movements. We have revolutionary movements of all kinds in places like China and India. So they begin to say, maybe we have to have a different way of understanding this. Yes, it's perfectly true that the Western world is more modern than the rest of the world. Yes, but the rest of the world can catch up. How can they catch up? By following the same path. And we call this developmentalism. We call this development, modernization, right? And in order to do that, we had to create structures within the Western universities that would help us understand these people. So what did we do? We said, well, we can't fiddle with the traditional disciplines, but we can add something. We can have area studies. So if a student in Great Britain or France or the United States wanted to study, let us say, China, well then, yes, he needs to take his course. He may be a student in political science or in sociology or in history, but he should take a year at least in which he studied everything about China. He has to know the politics of China, the economics of China, the literature of China, the culture of China, and then he can also apply that. So all of a sudden, what we have in Western universities is an emerging cadre of people who are saying, yes, I am a historian, or yes, I am a sociologist, but I'm also a specialist on China. Okay? Now, I'll give you a very interesting statistic. Up to 1945, in Harvard University's Department of History, there was only one dissertation, one, that was ever written on a subject, on a historical subject about a country other than those of the Western world. Only one. Today, hundreds. Now, what that meant is that it had a big impact on the departments, because now all these young people got PhDs, and all of a sudden, in Harvard's, to use that as an example, in Harvard's Department of History, whereas in 1940, half the professors were professors of American history, and the other half taught maybe German history, French history, British history, and that was it. Okay? Now all of a sudden we have professors teaching Chinese history, Latin American history, African history, right? Etc. Russian history. And then we have students who take this. So all of a sudden we have a reorientation of what is going on in the Western university. The second thing that's beginning to happen has to do with specialization. It is said, in theory, that if you write a PhD dissertation, it has to be an original piece of research. So what does an original piece of research mean? Well, if in 1750 you could write something on the history of Germany, by 1900 it was no longer original to do that. You did it on 17th century Germany, and then you did it on an even narrower topic. And what was happening was, as you moved towards smaller and smaller and more detailed topics, you were running out of space. So what begins to happen is what I call academic poaching. The economists begin to poach on the sociologists, who begin to poach on the historians, who begin to poach on the anthropologists, and so forth, with adjectives. So where we had history before, we suddenly have social history. And where we had sociology before, we suddenly have economic sociology and historical sociology, and so forth and so on. So we begin to have a big overlap. And it becomes a rather, the logic of the disciplines begins to disappear. Now then, a second thing happens, and this is important to see, and that is there is a structural crisis in the world system as a whole. And all of a sudden, we get, within the sciences and within the humanities, new knowledge movements. Now, let me tell you what a knowledge movement is. Any idea, any proposal that you make of any kind, you can prove that somebody said it 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago. That's very easy. Nothing is ever new in that sense. But that's not important. To find the intellectual history of an idea is not necessarily interesting. What is interesting is this an important idea in terms of contemporary knowledge? Do people use this in some significant way? A knowledge movement is a group of people who are putting forth a non-conventional idea with enough strength numerically and intellectually such that they have to be taken seriously. And so we get the emergence of knowledge movements, first of all within the sciences, the natural sciences, which we now call complexity science, or the sciences of complexity. And these people were challenging Newtonian science in a very fundamental way. They didn't have to be a majority. They were a significant minority. And they were saying Newtonian science as a specialized epistemology is simply wrong. We have an alternative view of the world. In our view of the world, for example, among other things, the history of there's something we call the arrow of history, the arrow of time, the arrow of time. Newtonian science had said that time was reversible. It's a kind of mad idea on the face of it, but it's basic to Newtonian science. That time was, in a sense, irrelevant because all truths were universal and permanent. And the new sciences of complexity said that's nonsense, that there's an arrow of time. Everything changes constantly over time, including all the things that we think of as stable, permanent universals. And so they were saying the opposite of what the scientists had said at the beginning of the 19th century. Instead of pulling apart, they were saying things that were close to what social scientists often said, the arrow of time, history. And then there was cultural studies that emerges within the framework of the humanities. And they said this whole business of the humanities having canons of beauty, that's nonsense, because all it is endorsing the preferences of a small group of people white Anglo-Saxon, etc., 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 male people, and that there are many other ways of knowing, and many other groups who know, in fact, said cultural studies. We all read the books or see the pictures in different ways that are equally valid. So they were saying the opposite of what the humanists said at the beginning of the 19th century, who were saying we have a very special way of knowing, which is through the canons of beauty. And they were saying something fairly close to what social scientists had been saying about the social basis of aesthetic judgments and of moral judgments. So instead of moving outward both and pulling the poor social scientists with the two horses going in opposite directions, we suddenly had social movements, knowledge movements, that were moving centripetally towards the center again. Now, they haven't quite reached it, okay, but that's where we are today. We have important knowledge movements in the natural sciences and important knowledge movement in the humanities that are trying to move towards a reconvergence of knowledge, such that we would get back to the old situation in which there was only one way of knowing. Now, what happens next? It depends. You see, this is part and parcel of the crisis of the world system as such. The knowledge movements, the structures of knowledge are a crucial, stable force within the existing system. They're breaking down. What will happen? It's possible they reconverge entirely, and then we are back to a reunified system of knowledge. Or it's possible that because of the bifurcation and one group winning out rather than the other group winning out, we are in some other situation. That all remains to be seen. We are in the middle of this struggle. Now, let me say one last thing, which is disciplines are an intellectual claim. That intellectual claim made sense in the 19th century. It doesn't make any sense today. But disciplines are two other things besides an intellectual claim. They are an organizational reality. All of you, students or faculty, are in some department here at this university and in all other universities. And you have to follow certain rules, right, in order to get your degree, or if you're a professor, to get your promotion, and so forth. And those rules tend to be defensive rules. They don't really encourage you to break down that discipline. Indeed, they encourage you, if you want to be rewarded, to stay within it. Okay? That's an organizational reality. It has nothing to do with intellectual reality. It has to do with the rules by which you as an individual can get opportunities within the university system or within the larger society. And the third thing they are is a culture. If I ask the very simple question, what 3 books are absolutely essential for a student in a given discipline to read, I will get a list of 3 books. In sociology, for a long time, the 3 books were the 3 scholars were Durkheim, Weber, and Marx. Every sociologist had to read those 3 and know them. If I ask an anthropologist, I'm not going to get the answer Durkheim, Weber, and Marx. I'm going to get some other 3 books. If I ask an economist or a historian, I'm going to get a different list of 3 essential books. That's a culture. That's a culture. That is a sort of ingrained bias that narrows your perspective. There's no logic to it. It grew up within each discipline for various reasons. I can explain why the sociologists chose their list of 3 key figures, and somebody else can explain the other 3 figures. But, yes, I have to stop now. So remember this. The intellectual justification for the existing disciplines has disappeared. The organizational pressures to remain within them are stronger than ever, and the culture is hard to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallerstein. I vacillate between Wallerstein and Wallerstein. You say it doesn't make a very deep division in the structure of your name. You painted for us in bold, brilliant strokes the development of a Western system of knowledge from single epistemology to its bifurcation into humanities and sciences, and then trifurcation, I don't know whether such a word exists, between science, social sciences, and the humanities. And then how this led to the impossible, untenable situation of knowledge. I think what we found very, very interesting was that you interspersed, not only interspersed, you painted this picture in terms of development in some social reality, social system, and so forth. I think that is what is very interesting about your this picture that you have painted for us. And then you told us about certain movements within the Western knowledge structure which are putting pressures toward single epistemology in terms of science of complexity and cultural studies and so forth. And you seem to think that this is the wave of the future. If I'm correct in understanding you, and I think it is for our discussants to comment on your talk. And first of all, I'd like to call on Professor Kim Sang-jun. Professor Kim Sang-jun is very well known to you. He was the moderator yesterday at Professor Wallerstein's talk at the Peace Palace, and he is a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy, is it called? The public policy, and he has recently wrote a book called the 맹자의 땀과 이 성왕의 피. So I'm promoting his book. Perhaps this will sell a few more books. But this is a very fresh, new look at Confucian civilization, and it is creating a small storm of its own. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Kim.
Why I feel warm in my heart. And I realized today that there is, I think, two reasons. First is that it's very personal, that it's just personal, not intellectual, without any reason. Professor Wallerstein actually reminds me of my advisor at Columbia, Alan Silver. You must know him. We're similar age. And secondly, I think there's some kind of a warmth caused by being close to intellectual giant. So, well, I have to be short in my raising. It's not comments. I would like to raise 2 points. Firstly, when you're talking about the reconvergence of knowledge, I think you also, your fingers are on the restructuring of the knowledge structure of university. And I think discipline is power as well. It's one of your points. How to reconstruct the structure of knowledge of universities of these days is a big issue. And I would like to ask, already you have suggested to reformulate and reconverge the various disciplines of social science. History is, for your definition, is one of the social science into three. One monothetical or quantitative. The second is ideographic or qualitative. The third is syncretive. That's my understanding, the suggestion. That's good. But also I would like to ask, then where is some kind of reconvergence between humanities and social sciences and natural sciences? Can I hear something more about your thoughts into the way of cooperation, collaboration, or... Okay, sorry. About the second point, I would like to read. Is about democracy. Democracy. Hinging upon your presentations of today and yesterday, I'd like to expand a little bit of your ideas. You've emphasized emerging something in both presentations, which is new, not determined, and thus unpredictable in the world system and in the structure of knowledge. That remains, in my terminology, at the realm of the unknown. I've thought that this idea of unknown could be applicable to improve, upgrade, and renovate the practices of existing democracy. I call this new democracy reflexive democracy, or reflexive consensus system. I will briefly summarize my idea and would like to ask you first if you think it can associate with your ideas, and second, you regard its practical suggestions could help the coming unpredictable and unavoidable change go to a more desirable direction. The core of the idea of reflexive democracy consists in the circulation of democratic feedback in the decision-making processes about public issues. Newtonian certainty, which has been believed to be monopolized by technocrats and scientists, has been the ultimate source of legitimacy for the state-centered or specialist monopolized policy-making processes. Newtonian certainty is now, as recognized by many, seriously questioned by the most advanced scientific achievements. As Ilya Prigozhin has proven, to take just an example, the fundamental uncertainty in the emerging bifurcations observed in the realm of non-equilibrium thermodynamics suggests the ever-changing, unforeseeable nature of material world in time. Reflexive democracy requires the very unforeseeable input from the public. The input of the unforeseeable factor makes the decision-making process, I believe, truly and more democratic. By the term truly democratic, I mean not only quantitative, but also, and more importantly, qualitative democracy. A truly democratic process provides us with the most reliable safeguard against unintended consequences of policymaking in the risk societies. To take a well-known example, I here want to draw upon the idea of the veil of ignorance, which was as well known, suggested by the John Rawls. Rawls still believed in the Newtonian credo of the equilibrium and the certainty. In this regard, I think he has many limitations. I just want to expand further on some of his good intuitions. By the idea of the veil of ignorance, John Rawls attempts to imagine the most ideal democratic and just decision-making procedure. Rawls here seems to suggest a paradox. A person who does not know can know better, or can make a better decision, as far as the decision-making of public issues is concerned. John Rawls here seems to, or at least we can interpret as such, step over his belief in the Newtonian dogma of equilibrium and certainty. His party, or agent, in the veil of ignorance, does not take balance or equilibrium between many contentious interests. Rather, Rawls's agent is supposed to be totally ignorant of her ascriptive and already known conditions on which she is supposed to make calculations based upon her interest. I think we can find the other within Rawls's agent in the veil of ignorance. Perhaps we can say it is the other self which is totally inaccessible or unknown if the one is attaching exclusively to his known self. This idea of unknown self, I think, is the most interesting part that we can attract from Rawls's theory of justice. This idea of unknown self is neither mysterious nor difficult to understand. To make it very simple, perhaps too simple, a person who is free from the interests of his own known self can make a better decision. Again, as far as public decision-making is concerned. We can find a similar and more original idea in the writings of Immanuel Kant, as he has repeatedly maintained the Ding an sich, the most profoundly inaccessible, unknown substance in his philosophical edifice, even exists in one's self. As well known, Kant put huge importance on the concept of the Ding an sich in his moral philosophy. Another interesting point in Rawls's theory is that he seems to imagine an ideal situation in which the unknown selves can make the best, the most just decisions and judgments. In what he calls original position, we can find such an imaginational attempt, but he stopped at the imaginational stage. How can we put the unknown into the process of decision-making in reality? How can we institutionalize the process? One possibility is the idea of citizens' assembly, the basic frame of which is as follows. Constitute a randomly chosen group of citizens. Provide them with the best information to discuss the issue by themselves. Third, make them decide. That's all of my...
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kim Sang-jun. he has made a proposal for a new kind of democracy, and he's asking your opinion about this. You will have a chance to respond to him, give him. Our next discussant is Professor Kim Young-sik of Seoul National University. When I first knew him as a colleague, he was in the Department of Chemistry. Then he became the chair of the joint program on philosophy of science and history of science. And then after I left Seoul National University, he moved to Department of East Asian History, and he became head of one of the research institutes in Korean studies. He seems to somehow embody the kind of reconvergence of epistemology knowledge that Professor Wallerstein seems to be advocating. I'm not sure, I don't know Professor Kim Young-sik's work well enough whether this is the case, but we'll hear from him now.
Well, thank you, Professor Kim, for nice introduction. We were asked to prepare and submit the text of our discussion. So I did that. I wrote it up. So I might just well read the text. Now, when I wrote this text, I did not know what Professor Wallerstein is going to say, except for one-page abstract. So my text is based on Professor Wallerstein's writings that I have read, and that one-page synopsis. So what I'll be saying might not neatly connect with Professor Wallerstein's remarks this afternoon. It's really the interest, my own speculation, following the direction of my interest on the topic that Professor Wallerstein raised. So I read from my text. In modern society, we are faced with a clear, often severe separation of the specialized scientific and technical knowledge from the interest and understanding of general intellectuals. This separation is so clearly and widely found today that people tend to assume this as the natural state that had existed all along. Yet, it was a rather recent phenomenon, a result of the specialization of science in the last few centuries. This process of specialization, led by the German universities in mid-19th century, spread to other countries. And by the late 19th century, the basic structure of science composed of the specialized disciplines as we see today were established. Afterwards, science kept increasing the degree of specialization while maintaining the skeleton of the same structure. Such specialization initially contributed to the growth and development of science and helped to create a social role of science, including the application of science to industry. Yet, while science was following this path of ever-increasing specialization, the way science was practiced and the place and role of science in society continued to change. In particular, as the specialization of science progressed, science became more and more big, expensive, practical, and industrialized. Science, formerly occupying a marginal place in society, became a more and more important element of society. At some point, however, science began to create problems. There appeared many problems which had not existed before, and the specialized sciences became less and less capable of dealing with these problems. To be sure, a great deal of these problems were for the scientists themselves, but there were problems for the general population also. Everyone living in the modern world has to face those problems that are becoming increasingly more serious for the entire population. Environment, energy, natural resources, weapons, and so on, which are either created by science or at least related with it. Even problems like the alienation of human beings and degeneration of values are attributed to the development of science. Indeed, science has come to be connected with most problems of modern world. While the general population has come to face this sort of problems, science has continued to become ever more specialized in its content. This made science even more alienated from them. And as the result, we are faced with a dangerous situation. While science has become more and more important for people, people were more and more separated from it. In the past several decades, I have been pointing out the danger and unacceptability of this separation. In particular, that such a separation encourages us not to have interest in what has become extremely important for us. It also encourages us not even to try to understand those things which we would understand if we tried. Reading Professor Wallerstein's recent work has made me realize that this separation may constitute a part of the development surrounding what he calls modern world system. And this realization has underlined the fact that this sort of separation was a uniquely Western phenomenon. It was not an event bound to happen in every culture in the course of its historical development. For example, such separation did not take place in East Asia, at least not to the degree it did in the West. In traditional East Asia, as in the West before this process of separation took place, there was no reason for general intellectuals, scholars, writers, or thinkers to exclude science or knowledge about the natural world from the range of their interests. Of course, this does not mean that science was pursued eagerly by the general intellectuals in traditional East Asia. But there were factors that encouraged interest in science and technical knowledge by Confucian scholars, the mainstream intellectuals of traditional East Asia. As the result, while science and technology were not subjects of primary interest for Confucian scholars, they did not exclude them. They did find a place for scientific and technical subjects in their system of learning and kept interest in and study scientific and technical subjects. There was never the kind of separation of science and technology that we find today. This separation came to East Asia with the adoption of Western science and technology in late 19th century, the time when the separation was intensifying in the West. And for reasons of which I cannot go into detail here, it has become especially severe in Korea, as is manifested in the peculiarly rigorous, stubborn division between Mun and Yi. Now, I do not know enough to feel confident to say that the separation I have been discussing was embedded in the modern world system. If it is, it may be that the demise of this world system predicted by Professor Wallerstein will solve it. but perhaps not. When a system is destroyed or replaced, not everything of the system goes away. This separation might still stay even after the demise of the modern world system. In this respect, it may be helpful to look at what happened during the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century Europe, when in the midst of fundamental changes of European society, accompanying the emergence of new modern world system, a new class of people were raising new problems and demanding new knowledge. While the universities, the traditional place for learning, did not come to terms with them, but clung to their traditional curriculum based on Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, and to the theoretical bookish discussions. In this situation, new scholarly activities that eventually were to answer the needs and solve the problems took place outside the universities, courts, and academies. In spite of the mounting pressure for changing the university learning, the universities remained as strongholds for traditional learning and centers of resistance against the changes and the new movements. Perhaps in our case too, the same kind of inertia and resistance will remain for some time and sustain the separation. Thus, we will still have to find ways to deal with this dangerous separation. And for that, we will need to realize more clearly the harms, the dangers of the separation. And we need to be more determined to change the situation. Now, what should we do then? I do not have a concrete answer, of course, except that this separation will not stay forever, because it cannot stay, because people and society will not let it stay, because people and society will not tolerate it. From what I have learned from history, from the ways in which great currents and changes of learning and thought, in particular those great ones that took place only once in centuries, from what I have learned from them, I can say perhaps that the changes and solutions that will solve our problem will probably be something fundamentally new, something that one would not recognize when they first come up, one would not recognize as ones that would eventually work as solution. Historical social science, suggested by Professor Wallerstein, may be a possible candidate, or perhaps something more unexpected than that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim Young-sik. I think Professor Wallerstein, you have found an ally, new ally in your drive for a new single epistemology. Our next speaker is Professor Kim Moon-ong. He is from the NGO, the Graduate School of NGO at
Sungkonghae University.
Yes, sorry. He is one of the foremost experts on the Wallerstein, so he should be able to put very enlightening questions to Professor Wallerstein. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Wallerstein, for your brief and also the clear introduction to the Western intellectual tradition and also the challenges it faced and also the current or the recent development. What I'm hearing from you is two key messages. Break down the defensive and divisive world discipline, existing disciplines, from the perspective of totality. The second part is re-examine the relevance critically, whether it is relevant to our contemporary age, what kind of authority it has, the intellectual discourse. And my concern is the first part, the critical examination of the relevance of any intellectual discourse. So my concern here today is a geopolitical question of knowledge concerning the future of the Northeast Asia, in particular Korea's role in the context of the structural crisis of a world system. Last night in his presentation, Dr. Wallerstein raised the question of the notion, redefining the notion of political strategy that has a moral power. The political strategy we need desperately in the midst of the structural crisis of modern world system. That may be a matter of the ethical dimension of our designing for a new society. He said that we stand on the crossroad to determine our future direction, even though the path forward is bifurcated in two different and opposite alternatives. One is a more hierarchical, exploitative, and polarized, and the other is more egalitarian and democratic. However, do we really have any epistemologically trustworthy ground to perceive the world around us and the powerful means of political commitment that could advance our life on the basis of the international solidarity? We could not resolve the global issues or challenges alone. In order to create a viable solution, we have to critically re-examine the geocultural or geopolitical foundation of our knowledge with regard to the global formation of the capitalist world system. As we witness now, the existing system of the world economy fails to provide the way out for the stability of capital accumulation. It is undeniably stagnated, or in the terminal crisis. We are experiencing so-called B phase of the contra-DF cycle and the final stage of the hegemonic status of the United States. The short-term contra-DF cycle seems to overlap the long-term hegemonic cycle, which produces, as you said, uncertainty in terms of predicting exactly what is going to happen in the next stage of the systematic change. And Dr. Wallerstein has argued that the centrist liberalism that began with the French Revolution in 1789 definitely lost its hegemony since 1968, the worldwide student revolution. And the alternatives of many kinds of alternatives, the left, old or new left, chose to realize through various kinds of struggles, have not successfully solidified their support on a world scale. If we are free to use Gramsci's insight, the new is not yet born while the old is dying. The Western notion of universalism or the Eurocentrism has been rejected now. A new epistemological basis has been required to understand the transformative logic of the global interconnectedness. The recent effort of the world history scholars reveal a serious struggle of the Western Academy to include so-called forgotten history of the non-Western part of the world and its people, as well as to reflect the subaltern voices that have been neglected. And I think this is a matter of the geopolitics of knowledge, or new knowledge movement, I think. Because where you live constitutes what you see, or where you dwells or you live determines what you think. For example, Dr. Wallerstein studied, as is a major field, Africa, and he saw the world through the harsh reality of African history under the colonial rule. And he analyzed the world through the geopolitical reality of African peripheral status in the capitalist world system. This geopolitical context requires us to think from that perspective to understand the present and the future of our life here and now. China, as we know, everybody knows that, is rising, and the West, including the United States, is currently confronted with internal political economic turmoil, as well as the external pressure upon the way they accumulate the capital. In other words, the West as a whole is in the trap of that economy, and consequences of financialization, while China is gaining upper hand. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we, the people of Korea, which is a divided nation, are situated geopolitically between these two globally competitive hegemonic powers. Under this circumstance, we are desperately in need of redefining our international role as a mutually trusted mediator. In this region, both the United States and China have a pivotal strategic interest in the Korean Peninsula. In 1950, the United States and China fought bitterly here to demarcate the line of a military or hegemonic advantage to no avail to each other. And now the Northeast region becomes again the major battleground for the two superpowers, as we know well. Historical situation we are encountering with currently is quite different from that of the 1950s. The United States is not strong enough to roll back the power of China, and China is not strong enough to isolate the United States in this region. The fact is that the Korea depends on both hegemonic powers for her survival. It is sort of ambivalent position, while it could be a point, I hope, a departure for the peaceful settlement of the structural crisis that the modern world system is going through. I believe that we could play a mutually trustworthy mediator between the United States and China. Korea may be able to show an alternative path toward a new stage of global peace and a strategy of transformation in the midst of a civilizational crisis of the world system. We, Korea, also went through, or have been through, the trap of the debt economy in 1990s, and the crisis of financialization, the long-term consequences along with the long-term impact of the speculation of capital in the market. And I have 5 questions concerning, the 2 is very brief, concerning the political strategy Dr. Wallerstein mentioned in his presentation. First, how could we systemize our understanding or knowledge about the nature of the present crisis of the modern world system from the perspective of the Northeast Asia? It may be a question of geopolitics analysis and also the matter of the awakening of its history or identity. Second, as you know, the late Gunder Frank suggested 5,000 years world system approach instead of 500. His way of analyzing the world system may be persuasively applicable to the East Asia's area, since it involves more than 5,000 years the dimension of a civilization. This is a kind of a geocultural significant constitute in this region. As I got this book just 1 hour ago from Professor Kim Sang-jun, another promotion. And this deals with this analyze. I haven't read this book yet, but the title shows that this analyze the world system, the Northeast Asia, from the perspective of the Confucian civilizational world system, right? Am I right? Okay. So I think the 5 years understanding of the world civilization may be applicable to this area. What do you think of this? And third, what kind of political struggle do you think we need here? Because the radical movements such as the Occupy Wall Street or the Wall Social Forum doesn't seem to wield the power that's strong enough, the degree we could expect. So what kind of political strategy do we need here in this region in order to strengthen or enrich international solidarity among those who support the world anti-systematic movement you just asked a long time ago? Okay, and the fourth and fifth is very simple. How do you define yourself? You are not sociology scholar, you're not historian, you're not political economist, you're not anthropologist. And how do you define yourself as a scholar? You study every field of these things, and how do you define yourself? And the last one is, what kind of a role do the public intellectual play right now here in the midst of the crisis, the world system? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kim Moon-hong, for your very interesting comments and 5 questions. I hope Professor Wallerstein will be able to deal with them all. The last but not least, of course, is Professor Kwon Ki-bung as the discussant. The Professor Kwon is rector of the Graduate Institute of Peace Studies of Kyunghee University, and he's a political scientist, inclined more toward political philosophy. I expect he will give a very balanced and judicious comment on Professor Wallerstein's talk. Professor Kwon.
Thank you very much, Rector Kim. And to take this moment, I want to express my gratitude and honor to be to be on the same podium with Professor Wallerstein and other distinguished faculties of the Kyunghee and Sungkongye universities. And I was a big fan of Professor Wallerstein while I was studying at the United States. But I had to admit that I was a big fan in a little bit critical senses. I was, not truly followed your paths as you suggested. And my comment will be mostly on epistemology positions you take, and also its implications on the universities and university educations. And because, as you rightfully stressed several times, and knowledge is housed in the universities, and whatever things we debate in scholarly terms has implications on educations and university structures. So certainly this time again, when you are debating this epistemology in the social sciences, it certainly influences the way we recruit the faculties and we train our graduates, and the way we expose and introduce the freshman collegemen to the system of knowledge. And I myself actually the product of the methodological debate. I started out in the 70s. My college started in the 70s, and my graduate starting in the 80s, and so that I was fully exposed to this kind of new science movement. And I have to say that to make my positions clear to everyone, I came out as a normativist and structuralist, and more of against the positivism and behaviorisms. And as a result, I'm a theorist but that I mostly ended up becoming a minority in universities and in my field in international relations theories, because despite my own exercise of wisdom and choices, I somewhat picked the wrong side, in the sense that the university is dominated by the other side of the schools, mostly positivistic, objectivistic, and number crunchers. But the betters again emerged and now fought again on a different ground. So maybe I have high hopes that my first choice is not the again lost in the next round. And this time, actually, I want to emphasize the fact that the methodological debate started out in the 70s and 90s is still going on, has another dimensions, meaning that the society itself somehow outstripped the academia. Already a society needing I would say is the staticization of sciences and scientization of aesthetics, as Professor Wallerstein emphasized in his recent books. And there is no clear divisions in knowledge the society needs and requires, but universities are highly divided, and so that we somehow ended up become a part of the crisis, educational crisis. And as a result, these scholars and universities as a whole begin to respond in earnest to this kind of crisis by introducing another way to address this disciplinary divisions. And mostly introducing interdisciplinary educations and programs in the universities. But this was a way to address the problems that the too much specializations and parcelizations, Wallerstein says, parcelizations and compartmentalizations of disciplines into its own territories and never creating any bridges in between and amongst themselves. So, but in a way, after 20 years of the experiences and of the major Western and U.S. universities in particular, we cannot say that this interdisciplinary initiatives had came out with all success and all with applause. Some universities have the interdisciplinary programs, still have the programs, and further pushing into interdisciplinary educations, but many of them rolled back to the departmental systems, and some of them completely gave up. So we do not yet have a final say on this is the way to go from the perspective of university administration and university curriculums. But in my view, when the universities in the West first introduced interdisciplinary programs, the major problem was, as he pointed out, was that there was no consensus how to do the interdisciplinary educations and researches, because there is no epistemological consensus of how you approach the subject, whether in natural sciences and in the social sciences. And as a result, the students, when they got into the interdisciplinary programs, they got into confusions. They didn't know how to integrate the all kind of experience, the methodological, approaches they learned from their professors, and eventually they had to pick a side. They were not integrative or interdisciplinary in themselves. Rather, they had to pick a side. Either you choose the positivistic, rationalistic, individualistic, or else cultural studies. So the product and result of interdisciplinary education was not that much interdisciplinary. And also, most of the graduates of the interdisciplinary programs found themselves are less competitive to the ones that are from the traditional department. So again, we are at this point, we have no way of saying we had some success with the interdisciplinary programs and educations. Interestingly, in recent years, Korean universities are trying to introduce interdisciplinary programs into their own traditional university systems. It came only after about 20 years of experience, U.S. and Western universities' experiences, but Koreans never learned from their experiences, but only having high hopes. But from my perspective and your perspective, and I expect you have advices to give to Korean universities and how we should introduce interdisciplinary educations and programs. And the second one is that it's about how to combine your epistemologically on your systems approaches with your emphasis on values. It's somehow you ended your speeches on emphasizing the choosing side and choosing, preferring the values you have in choosing the bifurcations. I mean, at the critical stages, somehow you have to make a choice. This choice has to be based on your values. That is what you emphasize. But your systemic structuralist positions is somewhat hard to be combined with your emphasis on value and value judgment. I want to have your personal comment on these questions. And third one is that you basically analogize the contemporary confusions on epistemology is close to the 1750 and 1850s. So I wonder whether it's a good analogies or not, because 1750 and 1850 is the time that we decide to go into the deeper specializations and departmental cleavages. But now we came out of these decisions and trying to move away from it. But in a different senses, again, I mean, in the same senses, we are in a confusions. But as I follow your theories, and we will be, choosing, time arrow is pointing at one direction, so we're not going back to the past, right? So that's my comment. And I want to save my comment to give more time to Professor Wallerstein and the audiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kwan. Now, would you like to respond to these comments? Yes?
Well, the problem is there have been an enormous number of issues raised by the four commentators. Each of them raised more than one. And between them, so I've tried to reduce what they have said collectively to a few issues. Okay? One issue, the term specialization, came up in several of the discussions. It's very interesting. Just recently, there was an important scientific finding and dispute. It had to do with something called the Higgs boson. I assume many of you read about the Higgs boson in the newspapers. And there's some argument about some important specialists in this field said that they had found the Higgs boson, which scientists have been looking for, and there are others contested it. Now, who here in this room can say which of this group is right? And the answer is no one. There are probably a dozen people in the entire world who know enough about this particular issue to give a plausible evaluation of the evidence. Now, it turns out that almost all our specialized scientific knowledge is of this nature, that it comes down to a dozen or 2 dozen, or maybe at the most 3 dozen people in the world who have the ability to say something sensible. The rest of us are reduced to believing them. Now that's a real problem, right? And it causes a lot of the problems that we have been discussing, but it's a reality. That is to say, how do we judge these specialists? Well, the way we judge these specialists is they have a reputation. And where do they get the reputation? Well, they went to certain universities, or they had certain recognitions by scientific societies, and that made them a titular specialist and not a fraud, because there are other people who might claim this knowledge and they're frauds. Right? So, in point of fact, we are reduced to a difficult situation in knowing whether the specialists are indeed right or not right. Now, why is that important? Because out of the specialist knowledge, there are decisions that are made all the time at a collective level for governments or other large groups, but even as an individual level. You have a tumor in your brain. Should it be removed or not removed? Well, if it's your tumor, you're worried about that, aren't you? And you want to decide whether you should or should not have the operation. But how do you know? You go to one specialist, and he says, yes, you need an operation. And you go to another specialist, and he says, no, you don't. You should wait, or you should do X or Y. And you say, well, should I or shouldn't I? That's very important. My life is at stake, and I don't really know personally. I have no way of personally knowing which is right. So I say I have to rely on one or the other, or I use other criteria. I use criteria which are not scientifically relevant, but may be relevant to me. So, now, this then gets raised as a question of science versus society. Are we collectively able or willing to challenge what specialists tell us? And if we're not, so we get a suggestion that we should have a reflexive democracy. Now, what does that mean? That means somehow that we will discuss the implications of all of this specialist knowledge, even though we're not specialists, in order to see some broader picture and push it in one direction or the other. Now, here is one end is the full belief in science, but we can't judge them because they're super specialists. And on the other, there's the anti-scientific view that all these specialists are just talking nonsense. And after all, we have quite a few people in the world today who are renouncing elementary scientific truths. For example, in the United States, recent polls have shown that over 50% of the population do not believe that there is such a thing as evolution. Well, all the scientists are telling us there are, and here over 50% of the population is refusing to believe it, and there are consequences to that in terms of political decision-making within the United States. And then there's a sort of in-between position, which Professor Kim was, in effect, advocating of a balance between total faith in the specialists and total refusal to give them any credence at all. And then the question is, where is this middle position? Now, we've heard the term, it should be relevant. Relevant in what sense? Well, we've heard different demands for relevance. Let's go back to something I was talking about yesterday. I said that in a structural crisis, there are 3 steps we all have to make. We have to somehow have an intellectual appreciation of what we think is going on. And then we have to make a moral judgment about where we think the world should move. And finally, we have to make a political judgment about what we ought to do to make the world move in that direction. Those are 3 separate things, but they come in that order. So the question of relevance for me, the first question is, what is the relevant kind of social analysis of the reality of the existing world? And this, I'm afraid, my neuroscientist who is a specialist on brain tumors is not the person who can tell me. At that point, I have to appeal to a much larger group of people than that. And I have to say, I say that we're in a structural crisis. I say there's a bifurcation. Do you agree with me? Maybe you don't. Let's discuss it. Let's talk it through. It's only when we talk it through that we can come to the issue of the moral judgments, which is the values question that Professor Kwan raised. Where do these values come from? Well, the values come from the fact that we have some kind of collective choice, and we have to decide we want choice A or choice B. It's very simple. That's a moral judgment. Where does it come from? Within us. That's all I can say. We learned certain moral values. We didn't all learn the same ones, and we come to different conclusions as a result. We like choice A because of one set of moral values, or we like choice B for another set of moral values. And then we can come to the politics, which Min Moon Kim was very concerned about. What should we do actually politically in Korea or in East Asia or in the world as a whole in the light of the existing situation? Well, that's a complicated question, as I tried to suggest yesterday. It isn't self-evident what we should do, but we can discuss it. Once we know that we want to move, once we know that the world is facing this kind of situation, and we want it to move in this direction rather than the other direction for moral reasons, then we can debate a tactical question, or a strategic question, if you want to call it that, of should we go on strike or not go on strike? Should we support a party or not support a party? Should we do X, Y, or Z that will in fact move the world? We can't begin to discuss that last question intelligently until we've discussed the 2 prior questions. So that's the relevance. Now, at the same time that we talked about this, which are issues not of the university, but far beyond the university, of the entire society, right? We've also, from time to time, slipped into discussing the university itself, right? And what it should do. For example, the whole issue of interdisciplinary programs, which have been extremely popular as a slogan since about 1945, faced with the confusions which emerged out of the overlap and all the other phenomena that begin to occur in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. People said, the solution is being interdisciplinary. I've never thought myself that was the solution, because interdisciplinary assumes disciplines. Interdisciplinary essentially says there's a problem. It's called labor. Or there's a problem, it's called health. And we are going to call in different disciplines. So there's the sociologist of labor and the historian of labor, and there's the economist who works on labor, and there's the sociologist who works on labor, and maybe there's still other people who work on labor, and we'll sort of go around the room, and what do you think, 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 and can we come up with some collective judgment? Now that, in fact, doesn't weaken the disciplines, in my view. That strengthens them. That says to them, each of you has a different bit of wisdom which you can bring to this subject, and we'll sort of try to put them together. And then the students find that rather hard to deal with, is what Professor Kwan suggested. I agree. But what I am advocating actually is a much more unified approach. I call it unidisciplinary rather than multi or interdisciplinary, to say intellectually these disciplines are not relevant, and that what I call historical social sciences or historical social science is the relevant unit of analysis. And what can I do in the university system? Well, I can do various things. I can, powerful president or rector that I am, I can announce that as of tomorrow we'll lump all these departments together, abolish them, etc. And you can hear everybody yelling and calling for the destitution of the poor rector who suggested that. So there's great resistance. But there's another question, you know. The question is, will the university survive? The medieval European university was a thriving institution in its way, and it didn't really survive. It became moribund from about 1500 to 1800, and more or less people who were interested in furthering knowledge went into academies of science, and they went into other kinds of structures that emerged, but they didn't teach in the university, right? Now, it may be that if I come back here in 20 or 30 years, the university system in Korea and in the rest of the world will all become moribund. Why? Because we have created a situation in which socially there is enormous pressure for everybody to go to the university. Now, everybody doesn't yet go to the university, but we're creeping up in terms of the percentage of the population who go to the university. And what does that mean? That means that the universities become these enormous structures, right, with people in the universities who want the credentials, but perhaps don't really want the knowledge, and it becomes extremely expensive. Enormously expensive. Who funds this? Well, either the states fund it, and the states are all tight on money these days, or the parents of the individuals, and of course the cost of education has escalated incredibly, etc. So in fact, what we do is what I call the high schoolization of the universities. They become more like high schools. They become more like babysitting institutions. Okay, now that's fine, but it's not terribly relevant for the creation of new knowledge. So what do the people who want to create new knowledge do? They begin to move outside of the university system. We've already had that with institutes of advanced studies. What are institutes of advanced study other than the old academies of science? Extra university structures. They don't have to teach students anymore. They just have to think and do their research. And you can perfectly well imagine a situation where by 2050 universities are irrelevant as structures of knowledge. They don't disappear. they become credentializing institutions, right? People want to go to it because without that credential they can't earn a significant living, and there is a real difference in the income level of people who've gone to the university and people who haven't gone to the university, but new knowledge won't be produced there. So what does that do to the social control of the knowledge institutions? So we have several different questions. We have the question of how can you assess specialist knowledge, and we really can't. Then what do we do about the relations of the specialists to the larger society? And that is a difficult problem to resolve, in which we have to come to an unstable middle ground, which is always shifting, but is very important to establish if we want to have what Professor Kim Sung-jung is calling a reflexive democracy, which is one in which people are able to discuss social realities constantly and be taken seriously and have their viewpoint integrated somehow into the whole. You talk of feedback, etc. And then we have to talk about the relevance of these changes in terms of the current situation, which I think I've tried to indicate how I see its relevance. It's terribly important that we have this debate. Well, we're having this debate right now, aren't we? I mean, this is a good sign that there is a round table at Kyunghee University talking about these issues, and that they should have these round tables going on everywhere within universities and outside of universities, because unless we can debate and think through these issues about where things are going, we're not in any way able to move things in the direction we want them to, which means that other people will be able to move things in the direction they want things. There's no abstention from this. You're either part of this or you're not part of this, but if you're not part of this movement, then you're just submitting yourself to the consequences of what other people are trying to impose upon you. So I come back to where I began. We need a single epistemology. We need a great deal of debate about where the world is moving, and we need, in the light of that debate, to decide where we want it to go and where and how we can get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallerstein. I can only admire the wonderful way in which you can marshal very different, many different concerns into one single issue of the epistemology. And my task as the moderator of this roundtable would be to give general audience chance to ask questions and make comments. And I turn this task over to Professor Shin.
아까 월러스틴 교수님께서 이제 대학에 대해서 어떻게 해야 되냐 그 말씀을 하셨는데, 저는 이제 여기서 우리가 지식 구조에 대한 논의를 하셨는데요. 분리든 융합이든 무엇이 더 나은가, 그런 것들을 판단하기 이전에 아까 말하신 대로 어떤 일이 있느냐 대학 사회에, 그걸 살펴보았을 때요. 어쨌거나 분리가 심화되는데 이 현상은 말씀하신 대로 자본주의가 계속된다면 심화될 것 같습니다. 어제 강연에서 연구 투자를 국가가 학문에게 행위를 하면서 이제 효율을 추구하게 된다고 생각을 했습니다. 그래서 당연히 과학이나 경영학 이런 것들을 대학에서 분리 육성하고 있다고 생각을 하고요. 결국 자본주의와 대학이 긴밀한 유착을 보이고 있다고 생각하는데, 현재 한국 대학들에서 통폐합에 대한 논의가 계속된다는 것을 아시는지 모르겠습니다. 이것은 단순히 학문들을 합치고 그 학문 간의 간격들을 메우는 것이 아니라 자본주의적 그런 관념들을 가지고 있는 기업들이 대학에 침투하면서 그 인기 없는 과목, 돈이 되지 않는 강의들을 다 합쳐버리면서 연구와 지원을 끊는 행위들을 하고 있습니다. 그렇고 또한 저희 학교도 자율전공학과나 이런 것들을 하고 있는데요. 대부분의 학생들이 경영학과로 많이 진학을 하고 있습니다. 교수님께서 학교를 돌아보셨는지 모르겠지만 경영대학이나 치전문대학 이렇게 돈이 되는 곳들에는 굉장히 많은 의리의리한 건물들을 지어주지만 문과대학이나 이과대학 같이 돈이 되지 않는 이 단과대에는 지원을 해주고 있지 않습니다. 그 건물을 좀 보시면 좋을 텐데요. 또한 지금 대학에서도 비정규직 노동자들을 고용하고 있습니다. 그들에 대한 처우를 개선해줄 의지가 있는지 저는 잘 모르겠고요. 그래서 말씀드리고 싶은 건 지금 대학은 말씀하신 것처럼 지식 생산의 주체가 아닙니다. 등록금 벌이 이제 산업도 좀 하시고요. 이윤 생성에도 많이 신경을 쓰시는 것 같은데 제가 말씀드리고 싶은 건 이런 논의들을 우리가 적용하기 위해서 그런 것들을 위해서 과연 대학교라는 그 틀 안에서 지금의 대학교의 틀 안에서 수정이 가능한가 의문스럽습니다. 그런 논의들을 실천하기 위해서 학문이 보다 학문답게 우리가 그 학문에 대해서 판단을 내리기 위해서는 그보다 먼저 현재 대학교라는 시스템 자체가 해체되는 게 맞지 않을까라는 생각도 하게 되었습니다. 여기에 대한 교수님의 생각이 듣고 싶습니다. 감사합니다.
The university, in theory, is an independent structure which is pursuing knowledge, pursuing and reproducing, producing and reproducing knowledge. That is to say, it's trying to be a place in which new knowledge is created, and it's also trying to be a place, in theory, which passes on existing knowledge to whom? To students, right? That is its function. However, this costs money. You have to pay the professors, you have to build the buildings, you have to pay for the light, etc. You have to get the money somewhere. People who give money make demands on you. If the state gives you money, they make certain demands. And they may say, we tolerate X, but we don't tolerate Y. For example, if you want to use your classroom to organize a revolution against the government doesn't feel it ought to give you money for that. Okay? If you're short of money and the government is no longer giving you money, you may turn to private enterprises and you ask corporations or other people who have money to donate to the university. And they in turn say, okay, but we want you to do X or we want you to do Y. The tension between attempting to produce and reproduce knowledge that is for its own sake and the fact of sources of money is a perpetual one. Now, on the one hand, the donors of money wish to create restrictions. On the other hand, if they create too many restrictions, right, then the university is no longer of any use to them. For example, do we need a university to train people to work in a factory or in an office, etc., even at reasonably skilled levels? It turns out that it's probably cheaper and more effective to do in-house training than to use the university system to train such people. So why do they use the university system to train such people? And that is because they see the myth of the independent university as somehow sustaining the overall system. So, there's a tension in which you, as an individual, or all of us as individuals, want X, the donors of the money want Y, and do we come to some compromise? Up to a point. Only up to a point. Okay? If you abolish the university system, what will you do? Create another university system? A different kind of university system? And where will it get the money for the lights? It has to get it somewhere. It has to get it somewhere. Okay? So the tension is always there. Within that tension, we can optimize what we do. So we can, for example, feel that we should have policy relevant, socially relevant knowledge produced within the university, and then some people will begin to yell and say, we were not going to give you money for that, that's left wing, or even that's right wing, whatever. But usually they say that's left wing. Okay? You're right. The people who are funding universities these days are indeed saying we prefer X over Y. That's true in the United States, that's true in Korea, that's true everywhere. And what the X over the Y is dependent on the situation. We don't want sociology because that's rebellious, but we do want engineering because that's somehow useful. So let's have more engineering and less sociology. At Yale, where I am now, there was an attempt 15 years ago to abolish the Department of Sociology as not being productive of anything useful. Well, that attempt was rebuffed in various ways. But that kind of thing goes on all the time. And you have to think of it as a perpetual dilemma. How to survive in a situation in which you are not and cannot be totally autonomous. That is our political dilemma, eternal political dilemma, and the university system is simply one locus within which that occurs.
네, thank you very much. 또 질문 있으신 분, 우리 학생. 예.
말씀하신 내용 중에 기본적으로 그 나아갈 방향에 대한 말씀을 하신 것 중에 현상을 알고 그 다음에 어떤 방향으로 나아가야 할 것인가 그 논의를 통해서 이제 그 다음 단계로서 정치적인 어떤 결정들이 이루어진다라고 하신 말씀이 인상 깊게 들었는데 최근에 뭐 오키파이 월스트리트 운동이라든가 아니면 유럽 재정위기라든가 아니면 2008년 금융위기 뭐 이런 것들을 겪으면서 자본주의의 실패 혹은 위기론 같은 게 대두되고 있는데 그러한 현상을 어떻게 보시는지 그리고 그 이후에 앞으로 나아가야 할 방향이 어떻게 돼야 된다고 생각하시는지 교수님의 의견을 한번 듣고 싶습니다.
This really was the subject of my talk yesterday, so I don't know if you want me to repeat that talk, but I suggested that the existing world system, which is a capitalist world economy, is in structural crisis. It will not survive very much longer, another 20, 30 years at the most, that we are faced with a bifurcation in which there are two real social alternatives, to which I gave names, but the names are unimportant. The spirit of Davos and the spirit of Porto Alegre, they represent real alternatives. I then discussed the kind of moral choice we have to make, and I also discussed the politics, and I pointed out that each of the two choices has within it two views about best political strategy. So I won't repeat that any further, but Occupy Wall Street is, of course, a particular political strategy within the overall political situation. It was an important movement. It is an important movement. And generally speaking, I personally am quite sympathetic to them. But the existence of such movements around the world is part of the existing political situation in which we find ourselves, and will continue to find ourselves for the next 20, 30 years.
네, 끝으로 한 가지 질문만 더 받도록 하겠습니다. 네, 우리 학생. 네.
네, 우리는 이제 자본주의 시대에 살고 있죠. 그래서 우리들의 지식도 이제 소비되면서 그런 지식을 배운 우리도 이제 소비된다고 생각해요. 그래서 이제 비유를 하자면 우리들은 상품이 되고 대학들은 공장이 되며 이제 학자라는 바코드를 찍어서 시장에 내보내지게 되는 것이죠. 그러려고 보니까 인문학이 터무니없는 학문인 겁니다. 이제 제가 물론 국어국문학과에 있지만은 사람들이 보기에는 정말 쓸모없는 학문이라고 생각하는 거죠. 지금 과학이 우세하고 있으니까요. 그래서 제가 소속된 국문과나 철학과, 사학과 같은 것은 위기라고도 이제 볼 수가 있다고 생각해요, 저는. 이런 상황에서 제가 인문학 쪽에 있지만은 그 인문학 쪽에 있는 시각에서 본다면은 저 멀리서 이제 과학이 저에게 침입한다고 보이는 것 같아요. 근데 물론 말씀하시는 대로 우리는 이제 조금 넓은 이제 모든 것을 아우르는 세계관을 가져야 된다고 생각하지만요. 침입이라고 하는 말이 조금 어감이 안 좋지만, 네. 여튼 그렇게 따지자 보면은 인문학에도 역시 과학이 필요할 수 있겠다라는 생각을 하게 됩니다. 구조주의 역사학자 페르낭 브로델인가요? 그분이 말하는 그 장기지속이라는 개념을 생각해 보면 우리는 이제 그 역사를 하나를 이해하기 위해서는 이제 그들의 문학이라든가 문화 아니면은 뭐 나아가서는 심지어 이제 자연과학의 지질학마저도 우리는 공부해야 된다. 그 밑에 그 베이스를 깔아두고 우리는 생각해야 된다라고 얘기를 하는데 이렇게 본다면은 우리에게는 인문학에는 과학이 필요하다고 생각합니다. 하지만 과학도 못지않게 인문학이 필요하다고 생각하는데요. 여기에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 질문하고 싶습니다.
Well, let me start with your almost opening sentence. You said I'm in Korean literature and that doesn't seem to be very useful. I don't know that that's true. Let's ask the question, is English literature useful subject to study? You know, that was a controversial question in 1830. The attempt to create a department of English literature at Oxford and Cambridge was very much opposed by the people who were in the classics department, which was then the only department of the humanities. And the idea that it was important to study English literature, they thought an absolutely crazy idea. So finally, actually, English literature muscled its way into the university system. It became actually, historically, a very powerful, in 1945 or even in 1980 or 90, if you looked at American and British universities, the English literature department, along with the history department, were the largest departments in professors, in students, and so forth. So somebody must have thought that English literature was useful, but useful for what? You see, what do you do with a degree in English literature? Well, you teach English literature. That's one thing you do. Or you become a critic. You write for a magazine reviewing new books, new novels. Or you work for a publishing company, helping them decide which books they should publish in novels. Okay? Or you forget about the fact that you've had a degree in English literature and you get a job doing something completely other than that because there isn't enough room for all the graduates of English literature. Now, so what do you do with a degree in Korean literature? Well, one thing you do is teach English literature. And the other thing you do is you become a critic for a magazine, or work for a publishing company, or do translation, or so forth. Is this a useful activity? Of course it's a useful activity. It's as useful to do Korean literature as it is to do English literature. But of course, all the literature departments now in the last 30 years have realized that they have to be broader than that. And they begin to change their names. Now it's not French literature, but French literature and culture. So they become a sort of larger structure in which they are attempting to be defenders of the differences of French culture from other kinds of national or global cultures, right? And then there are people who begin to say, no, we shouldn't do that. We should do comparative literature. And then there are other people who begin to say, well, we should do world literature, and we should begin to try to analyze quantitatively even, trends in world literature over the last 200 years. And then finally, there are people who say, well, let's give up the ghost on that entirely and merge with a history department. So we become East Asian historians, starting out having been not a professor of chemistry, but a professor of Korean literature. Okay? So these are all, how shall I say, open questions, because we are stuck with the categories that emerged in the what I call the 1850 to 1945 period, and the fact that you have a department called Korean literature is simply a replica of what happened in the West. You say, I notice you have a department of English literature, we should have a department of Korean literature. It's an acceptance of the same system, and that system is now coming into question in the West, in Korea, and elsewhere, and we have to move towards a reconstruction of the structures of knowledge, which is what we've been discussing.
이상으로 피스바 페스티벌 2012 국제회의 라운드테이블을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 끝까지 참여해 주셔서 대단히 감사합니다.